Okay, let's be honest. Is there anyone out there who isn't at least a little bit fascinated by haunted houses? I mean, come on. The creaking floorboards, the shadows, the thought of something unseen watching. It's classic horror. And when it comes to haunted houses, you can't talk about them without mentioning 112 Ocean Avenue, the Amityville Horror House. It seems like this one story just won't die. Over 40 films, TV shows, documentaries. Something about it just keeps pulling people back.
It's a real cultural phenomenon.
So let's take a deep dive into this horror giant. We're going to trace its origins, look at the impact it's had, and maybe uncover some surprising facts along the way. Ready to explore the dark side of suburbia?
Absolutely. It's fascinating because the Amityville story starts with a real-life tragedy. The brutal DeFeo family murders back in 1974.
Yeah, those details, they're just chilling. 6 members of the family all shot and killed in their sleep. And in this seemingly normal house, like it looks like any other house in any other suburb. It's kind of unsettling how such darkness can find its way into the most ordinary places.
It is unsettling. That contrast between the idyllic facade of suburbia and the potential for violence hiding right there beneath the surface. And then, of course, just a year after those murders, the Lutz family moves in. That's when the legend of the Amityville Horror really takes off.
Yeah, their story, it became the book The Amityville Horror, a true story. They claimed they were driven out by terrifying paranormal activity. After only 28 days, I mean, swarms of flies, strange odors, voices. Some of those details, even if you're skeptical, they kind of stick with you.
Oh, absolutely. It's this clever mix of the totally mundane and the totally bizarre, right? Like a broken thermostat. That's something everyone's dealt with. But when you pair it with demonic voices and cold spots, suddenly it becomes a whole lot creepier. I think that's what's so brilliant about the Amityville story. It blurs those lines between what's real and what's made up. You're left wondering, what am I supposed to believe?
And that blurred line, it made its way to the big screen in 1979 with, the original Amityville horror film. And it wasn't just a hit, it was a box office sensation. Do you have any theories on why it resonated so strongly with audiences?
Well, I think the film really tapped into some deep anxieties people were feeling at the time. The late 70s, it was a period of upheaval, the Vietnam War, Watergate. There was this sense of disillusionment with the American dream. People were starting to question the systems they thought they could trust.
And then you have this film, and it takes the ultimate symbol of that dream, a beautiful new home, and turns it into a complete nightmare. It plays on this primal fear we all have, I think, of the familiar turning hostile. Like even the things we think are safe can betray us.
Exactly. And it subverts the whole idea of upward mobility, doesn't it? You have the Lutzes, this young family, they're striving for a better life. And in a way, they're punished for that ambition. It's like a twisted cautionary tale about the dangers of wanting something more.
And the house itself, this imposing Dutch colonial looming large on the screen, it practically becomes a character in its own right.
It's a very visual film. That sense of isolation is emphasized so well. It's surrounded by water, shrouded in fog. The house is completely cut off from the rest of the world.
Perfect breeding ground for fear and paranoia.
Exactly.
It's also interesting how the film subtly hints that the house might actually be exploiting the family's weaknesses. George Lutz's temper, Kathy's anxieties, all their flaws seem to become amplified under the house's influence. It's like the house is feeding off their vulnerabilities.
There's a real sense that this evil, this force, it's not just present, it's actively manipulating them, pushing them towards self-destruction. And that adds this whole other layer to the horror. It's not just about the environment, it's about losing control, not just of your surroundings, but of your own mind. And of course, after the success of the original, well, things kind of exploded.
We went from one chilling film to a whole universe of sequels, prequels, spin-offs. Not all of them were winners, let's be honest.
Right, some definitely missed the mark.
But even with the mixed bag of sequels, we start to see some key themes emerging.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Amityville 2, the possession took a pretty dark turn. It focused on a fictionalized version of the DeFeo family called the Montellas. There was a lot of focus on demonic possession, dysfunctional family dynamics. It really pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in horror at the time.
And then there was Amityville 3D, trying to cash in on that whole 80s 3D craze. That one focused more on a skeptical investigator, so there were more visual gimmicks than real psychological tension.
Right. But even across all those different films, some core themes keep popping up.
Like what? What do you see as the connecting threads in the franchise?
Well, there's the idea of the haunted house being a reflection of our personal fears. This manipulation by unseen forces preying on our weaknesses. And of course, that constant tug of war between logic and the supernatural. Do you believe in this stuff or not?
It's like the franchise is trying to grasp this idea that evil might not just be this external force, but something much more insidious, something embedded in our reality.
Right. And that's maybe what makes it so compelling. It forces us to consider that maybe the darkness isn't out there in the shadows, but woven into the places we consider safe.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The real-life tragedy, the Lutz story, that original film success, and the sprawling nature of the franchise.
Mhm.
But there's more to unpack here, right? I think we need to talk about the lasting impact of the Amityville horror, not just on horror films, but on our culture as a whole.
Oh, definitely. Amityville, it's not just a story, it's become a full-blown cultural touchstone. I mean, think about it. It's influenced so many other horror films, from The Conjuring to Paranormal Activity. It's even spawned a whole subgenre of reality shows about paranormal investigation.
And the real-life house, 112 Ocean Avenue, it's practically a pop culture icon. Even after they changed the address to try and deter visitors, people are still drawn to it. What do you think it is about that specific place that continues to fascinate people?
I think it's become a symbol, a focal point for our fascination with the macabre. The things we can't explain, the places where logic fails us. It's like the house itself embodies the dark side of the American dream, you know? The idea that even the most idyllic setting can harbor something sinister. And speaking of other horror properties, I'm curious, how do you think the Amityville horror stacks up against other iconic franchises that deal with similar themes?
Well, I'm thinking of things like The Conjuring and Poltergeist, right?
Yeah,
They all explore haunted houses, but they seem to approach the supernatural in very different ways.
that's a good point. The Conjuring, for example, leans heavily on faith and the power of religious belief to combat evil. The Warrens, the paranormal investigators, use their faith as a weapon. There's a sense of hope there, a belief that good can actually triumph over evil.
Which is a pretty stark contrast to the tone of the Amityville films.
Right. It's much bleaker. There's almost this feeling of inevitability, like no matter how hard you fight the house, the evil will always win. The Conjuring is ultimately about resolution, about banishing the darkness. Amityville is about the persistence of evil. It's much more ambiguous, much more unsettling.
Then you have something like Poltergeist, which is terrifying, but there's also a strong emphasis on family unity in the face of the supernatural.
That's a key difference. It's a story about the power of love to overcome adversity. The family faces horrifying things, but they ultimately come out stronger because of their bond.
Whereas in Amityville, the family is often torn apart by the house's influence. It preys on their weaknesses, drives them to the brink of madness, and ultimately leads to destruction. That's a real through line in the franchise, this sense of despair and hopelessness. You almost never get a happy ending in Amityville.
Right. Poltergeist is about resilience, finding hope amidst the darkness. Amityville is a cautionary tale. It suggests that even the strongest bonds can be broken, that sometimes the darkness is just too powerful.
And that's what makes the Amityville horror so unsettling, isn't it? It taps into these primal fears, reminds us that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't lurking in the shadows, but right there in our homes, in the people we love, in the fabric of our reality. It's not a comfortable thought.
No, it's not, but it's a powerful one. And I think to really understand the Amityville horror, we need to go a bit deeper. We need to explore the psychological aspects of this story, how it plays on our fears, our anxieties, and our understanding of what's real and what's imagined.
And that's exactly what we'll be doing in part 2 of our deep dive into the Amityville horror. So join us next time as we continue our journey into this unsettling world.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Amityville horror. We were just talking about how this franchise, it's not just about those cheap scares, the gore. There's something much deeper going on, this psychological element that really gets under your skin. And it stays with you long after the credits roll.
It's like it wants to make you question your own sanity. You start to wonder if you can even trust what you're seeing, what you're hearing, that blurring between reality and delusion. It's super unsettling.
Think about George Lutz in the original film and how he descends into madness. The house seems to amplify all his negative traits. The anger, the frustration, his darkest impulses. It's like we're watching him transform from this loving husband and father into someone volatile and dangerous.
It's not just George, though, is it? I mean,
Yeah.
almost every character in these films, to some extent, they experience some kind of psychological unraveling. It's as if the house is this catalyst, bringing out the worst in everyone, exploiting their weaknesses.
Yeah, that vulnerability to the house's influence, it's definitely a recurring theme. It makes you think about how fragile the human psyche really is. How easily it can be shattered when you're exposed to extreme stress, or in this case, maybe supernatural forces.
And that fragility is heightened by the fact that the films never really give you a straight answer. Are these characters actually experiencing paranormal phenomena, or are they just losing their minds? That ambiguity keeps you constantly on edge.
That's what makes it so effective. They keep you guessing, never confirming or denying the supernatural. You're forced to confront your own fears and anxieties. Like, if I was in that situation, would I be able to tell what was real?
I think that's where the real horror lies. Not in the ghosts or demons, but in that possibility that our own minds might betray us. That the world we think we know, that it might not be as stable as we believe it to be.
It's not a comforting thought. And the fact that this whole story, the Amityville story, is presented as being based on true events, it just adds to that feeling of unease. Whether you believe the Lutzes or not, there's still this nagging thought, this suspicion that maybe, just maybe, something really dark happened in that house.
It makes it feel more real,
Yeah.
more immediate, more threatening. Suddenly, it's not just a ghost story. It's this reminder that the world can be a very scary and unpredictable place.
And that the things we rely on for comfort, our homes, our families, even our own minds, that they might not be able to protect us from the darkness that exists both inside and outside of ourselves.
A pretty bleak outlook. But there's something about it that's so compelling. The Amityville horror, it kind of forces you to face this uncomfortable truth, that maybe evil isn't just some external force, but something much more ingrained in our reality.
Yeah. It's not about those cheap scares, the gore. It's about exploring those dark corners of the human psyche, the places where fear and paranoia take root and grow.
We've talked about the psychological effects on the characters, the people who live in the house. But I'm also curious about the filmmakers. Do you think there's a psychological toll that comes with creating these kinds of stories, especially when they're dealing with such dark subject matter?
I think it's unavoidable. Horror filmmakers, or anyone who creates art that deals with the darker aspects of humanity, they have to grapple with the psychological impact of the stories they're telling. It's a delicate balance, you know? On one hand, you're trying to create this terrifying, compelling experience for the audience, but on the other, you're immersing yourself in this world of darkness, of violence. It would be impossible not to be affected by that on some level.
Stephen King, he once said, monsters are real and ghosts are real too. They live inside us and sometimes they win. Do you think there's truth to that, especially for people who create horror?
I think there's definitely a risk for anyone who creates horror, who explores the dark side of human nature, that they might become consumed by the very things they're exploring. I think self-awareness is key here, being able to separate the art from reality and maintaining healthy boundaries.
It's like staring into the abyss for too long. Eventually the abyss starts staring back.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to have a strong support system. People you can talk to, outlets for processing those emotions, the psychological weight of the work you're doing. Otherwise, you risk getting lost in that darkness.
That's a good reminder, I think, for all of us, not just horror filmmakers. I mean, we all have our own inner demons, our own fears and anxieties, and finding healthy ways to cope with those, making sure the darkness doesn't consume us, that's important for everyone.
We've talked about the characters, the filmmakers, but there's another layer here that's worth exploring, the power of place. I mean, in the Amityville horror, the house itself is almost like this living, breathing entity.
It's true. 112 Ocean Avenue, it's become synonymous with haunting. Even though they changed the address, renovated the house, people are still drawn to it. Why is that? What is it about that specific location that continues to fascinate people, even after all this time?
I think it's a combination of things. You have the real-life tragedy, the DeFeo murders, this horrific crime that shattered the sense of safety in a seemingly ordinary suburban home. And then you layer on top of that the Lutz's claims, the paranormal activity, adding this whole other level of mystery and intrigue. And then, of course, the films themselves, which have visually ingrained this house into our collective consciousness.
It's like the house has become the symbol of everything we fear. The potential for violence hiding beneath the surface of normal life, these unknown forces that might be pulling the strings, and this idea that evil can linger in a place long after the original events have passed.
The Amityville house is almost like a pilgrimage site for people who are fascinated by the macabre. It's a place to test your courage, to confront the unknown, and maybe, just maybe, to try and make sense of the senseless.
It makes you wonder if there are other places like that out there. Locations where history and horror intersect, leaving this mark on the landscape and on our psyches.
Absolutely. Think about places like Auschwitz, Chernobyl, or even the ruins of Pompeii. These are locations that have witnessed unimaginable suffering and loss. Stark reminders of how fragile life is and the capacity for darkness that exists within humanity.
And yet, as horrific as these places are, people are still drawn to them, visiting them, paying their respects to the victims, confronting those darkest chapters of human history.
It's a powerful impulse, this need to bear witness, to acknowledge the suffering that happened, and maybe to try and find meaning in the face of tragedy.
Like we're trying to understand how these things could happen, and maybe, by understanding, prevent them from happening again.
It's a heavy topic, but it's an important one to explore, and I think it speaks to a deeper truth about the Amityville horror. It's not just a story about a haunted house, it's a story about the human condition, about our capacity for good and evil, and about the ways we grapple with that darkness, the darkness that exists both within ourselves and the world around us.
You've hit the nail on the head there. The Amityville horror, for all its flaws and inconsistencies, it resonates with us because it forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in.
It's a reminder that the monsters we fear, they might not be lurking in the shadows, but in the very fabric of our reality. And that's a thought that can stay with you long after you've finished watching the film.
So, as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's worth asking ourselves this. What are the places that hold power over you? What locations evoke a sense of wonder, dread, or unease? And what stories do you carry with you about those places? Maybe by reflecting on these questions, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, our relationship to the world, and the power of stories, both real and imagined, to shape our experiences. Welcome back. So we've been talking about Amityville.
Yeah, that house, the stories, the films.
But as much as that one place has captured people's imaginations, it's not the only one, right?
Not even close. We've touched on it a bit already, but I think it's worth diving a little deeper into this idea about the power of place.
The idea that locations can hold a kind of energy, a darkness, that goes beyond just the physical space.
Exactly. And that these places, they can have a real impact on us. They can evoke fear, fascination, even a sense of awe.
Think about somewhere like the Tower of London.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, it's this incredible historical landmark.
Centuries of history within those walls.
But it's also a place steeped in tales of imprisonment, execution, restless spirits. You could practically feel the weight of all those stories pressing down on you as you walk through those halls.
It's almost like the stones themselves are whispering secrets.
Yeah, secrets of power struggles, betrayals, violence, things that happened centuries ago, but somehow they still feel present.
And it's not just these grand historical sites. Sometimes even seemingly ordinary places can hold that kind of darkness, especially something truly horrific has happened there.
The energy just seems to linger.
It's like the place itself has been marked, scarred by those events.
Think about those steps in Georgetown, the Exorcist steps.
Oh yeah, made famous by that terrifying scene in the film.
Even though it's just a movie, people are still drawn to that spot. They want to see the place where fiction and reality collided, where Father Karras was thrown from that window.
It speaks to that part of us that's fascinated by the unknown, by the possibility that maybe there's something more to these stories than we realize.
We've touched on some pretty heavy places too. Auschwitz, Chernobyl, Ground Zero.
Places where the horror, the suffering, is undeniable.
And yet people still visit them. Not for entertainment, but to pay their respects, to remember the victims, to confront those dark chapters of human history.
It's a form of pilgrimage, but driven by grief, by a desire for understanding.
It's like we're trying to make sense of the senseless, to understand how such darkness could exist in the world.
And I think that ties back into what we've been discussing about the Amityville horror. It's not just about a haunted house. It's about this much larger idea that darkness can exist anywhere, in seemingly ordinary places, in seemingly ordinary people.
And that confronting that darkness, acknowledging it, is part of what makes us human.
It's not easy, but it's necessary.
So we've explored a lot of dark corners in this deep dive. We've talked about tragedy, about fear, about the power of stories, and the places that hold them.
And the ways in which these things, they shape our understanding of the world and of ourselves.
Maybe the most important takeaway is this. We all have our own Amityville houses, so to speak, our own places, our own stories that hold power over us, whether it's a physical location, a memory, or even just an idea.
And it's up to each of us to decide how we confront those shadows.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.